Welcome to Mom Bods and Margaritas, where two childhood friends navigate the wild and crazy world of midlife.
That's right. We're diving into the ups and downs of relationships, motherhood, health, sports, and everything in between.
Join us as we share our personal stories, laugh through the challenges, and explore how to thrive in this transformative phase of life. Whether you're feeling lost, empowered, or somewhere in between, we're here to remind you you're not alone.
So grab a coffee or a margarita, settle in, and let's embark on this journey together. It's time to embrace the chaos and celebrate the beauty of midlife. Let's get started. So today we're talking about grief, so I thought it would be only appropriate to have a glass of wine instead of a margarita. Do you have a margarita? Oh, wine. Nice. What kind are you drinking?
Mine's rosé.
Oh, fancy.
It's just what I had in there, so.
I'm not even really sure what this is. I think it's a Cabernet Sauvignon. I really like the dark reds and a little more bitter. So,
I can't drink red. I don't like it. I've tried. Everyone says if you will just drink it and get used to it, you'll love it. But I
yeah,
just don't like warm wine, so I don't
yeah,
ever drink it.
yeah. I really like it. And I'll even catch myself drinking it, which is probably a huge no no. But during the summer, sitting outside, people are like, oh, how can you drink that room temperature hot wine? But it's really good. I enjoy it. So, how's your week been so far?
It's been fine. Yesterday was my birthday, so it's just another day, and I just worked in the yard and cooked dinner and did nothing. Jeffrey came in town last night, so I think at our age sometimes it's fun to celebrate, and other times it's just like
Meh.
whatever.
Yeah,
My kids have school and work, and so it's not. It was on a Monday night, so it just really wasn't feasible to do anything. But that's fine. I didn't care. It really doesn't matter to me. I've never been a big birthday celebration person anyway.
yeah.
Obviously, when my kids were younger, I was, but it's I don't know, it's just not my thing. So,
Yeah. Well, I normally am a huge birthday person. I like to celebrate mine starting the first day of the month, even though my birthday's the 26th,
right.
and party it up all month and get excited about it. But I'll say the last few years have been spectacular. So last year, even though I was turning 50, it wasn't ideal. My oldest son had me a little party. You were there. But primarily it was overshadowed by a lot of other stuff going on. And so I'm going to say I'm blowing it out for 51 regardless. I may do it by myself, but, I'm planning on having a much better birthday this year.
Well, I'd hope so.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know we're talking about grief today, and I have some notes on my phone, which I really don't want to go to because it's going to black out my screen and kind of mess up our recording. I'm a little bit gun shy when we've got all this equipment going. But I will mention I took some screenshots today because on my lunch break, I happened to see Jim Carrey and some things that he had talked about grief. And it was so impactful and talking about, the obvious. Some days it's really heavy, some days it's light. You have to deal with it, you have to move through it. And it was just really impactful. So if you can, any of our listeners, if you can find that quote from Jim Carrey about grief, it is really impactful and spoke a lot to me.
Well, I took some notes today too. I've got everything over here on my iPad. Um, I think the website that I was on, it was like a health hospice care. It was kind of like a three in one. I forget what the other thing was, but it was like health, hospice, and something else. And it said it was written by like whatever the name of the site was. I don't think I screenshotted it, but it was written by a staff member there. So I assume it was either a therapist or a doctor or nurse or someone. It wasn't just a random article that I found.
Mm-hmm.
So I also took some notes from that too. It was actually really good. And I tried to cross reference with other websites.
Mm-hmm.
And just as far as what grief is and like the 5 stages of grief, and everything I came across was pretty much the same.
Yeah.
And the 5 stages were the same. It's based off a book that was written years ago by someone who I can't remember her name. I didn't write it down, but um, it's just really interesting. There's certain subjects that we talk about where I always love talking to you about anything, but there's some that really hit home. For
Sure.
me, it's always like the relational friendship or, intimate relationship, but it's like the female friendships and grief and things like that. And I think it's because usually those two areas were such big deals in my life and
Sure.
so important. And it just hits me differently than if we talk about like stress management
Yeah.
or, nutrition or something like that. So I'm kind of excited to talk about this, even though it's not really an excitable issue to talk about, if that makes sense.
It does. And I think for me, at least, and maybe I'm just being over analytical, shocker, but I think grief expands far beyond death. I
Oh, yeah.
think grief, I mean, obviously, you can grieve relationships, but I think you can also grieve what you thought your life was going to be, or grieve what you thought your future was going to be. And that could be anything. That could be a job, that could be friendships, that could be a relationship,
Mhm.
that could be, you know, your family members. There's so many different things. Your financial situation. I think grief expands really far beyond death. And it's ironic that we're talking about this subject. I know you and I discussed this briefly, as we were talking about our subject matter, but my dad is currently in a nursing home. He was just admitted last month, toward the end of the month, and he is not doing well. He's been on hospice for several years. He has supranuclear palsy, or progressive, and it's essentially an offshoot of ALS. And so, the average lifespan for someone with that diagnosis is 3 to 5 years. And we began that path in 2020. So here we are going into the fifth year, and it's something that I'm bracing myself for. My grandmother is going to be 93 next Monday, a week apart from your birthday. And she is also on hospice, although she's probably been doing a lot better up until the last maybe week. And she's not doing well either. So I think when you see the signs and you see those things coming, you start to brace yourself for impact. I've been very blessed to have both of my parents and a grandparent still left, but I know that that time is coming to an end.
Right. Yeah. And I think when you and I were talking about when we wanted to bring up this on the podcast, it was in the middle of me also attending two different funerals, I think within a week. I think they were the
Yes.
same week. So we were talking about your dad and your grandmother and then these two funerals. So but again, like you said earlier, even on my notes, it's not necessarily about death. I know that
Yeah.
grief usually, that death is usually surrounding that, or that's the instigator in a process of grieving. But
Yes.
it's so many other areas, like you said. It can be divorce, it could be a friendship, it could be a
Yeah.
job, it could be, the end of an era,
Yeah.
motherhood, when you go through certain seasons in motherhood, empty nesting, like we talked about before. So there's a lot of different um, things out there that can cause you to grieve. And
Sure.
it's perfectly normal. I think
Yeah.
it's just important to talk about. I know not everyone likes to talk about it. And sometimes I'm that person. If I'm in the middle of it or I'm going through an issue, I don't necessarily like to be bothered or
Yeah.
someone always calling me or knocking on my door or visiting. I have friends that it's almost like their love language. They love to be around other people. And when
Mhm.
they're not, just in general, it
Mhm.
it affects them. And I'm
Mhm.
sort of middle of the road. I like to be around people and my friends and my family, but I also like my alone time. And
Yeah.
so when I'm going through a hard time, I do a lot of thinking, whether it's in the car or at home or whatever. And sometimes I just don't want to be bothered. I want to be left alone.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to not like get off key here and go down a path that will take me 30 minutes to explain. But I tend to treat others like that too.
Yeah.
And it's a
Sure.
struggle because I will give people space because I want it
Mhm.
sometimes. And I don't want, I'm afraid that that will be mistaken for me not caring or me not reaching out. Or
Yeah.
does that make sense? I
It
just like my
absolutely
space.
does.
But as far as death goes, I've not had to go through that personally in a long time. So
Yeah.
my grief has been through other areas,
Mhm.
relationships, we'll get into all that, but um so I don't know, this may be different now when the time comes and I'm having to deal with the loss of a friend or a loved one.
Mhm.
I may react differently now that I'm older. I may want that interaction with someone. I don't know. But everyone grieves differently and it's fine. And
Yeah.
that's what we have to remember and understand.
Well, number 1, there are no rules, and number 2, I'm very much like you. I am a verbal processor, which basically means I talk things to death, but that is how I think. Is I talk to get it out, to think and process. And I may start in one place and end up somewhere completely different as I'm talking myself through it. But I'm very much like you. I'm energized by people. I deal with people a lot, and there are times that I'm like a turtle. I just want to come home and get in my shell and decompress because I've had to be too peoply all day. And the same thing goes when you're going through something really hard. There were days where, when I was going through my divorce, I couldn't shut up about it. I mean, I would tell the bag boy at Publix if he would listen. And then there were other days that I thought, I just can't talk about this anymore. I'm exhausted. And there are studies out there, even though I do believe therapy and all those things are really important. There are studies out there that the more you talk about your problems, the more you focus on them, and the harder they are to get through and get to a resolution. And that's why some people stay in therapy. Again, not knocking it, but that's why some people stay in therapy for years and years. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're making progress. But when you're stuck in the same spot over and over, you kind of have to say, let me cut that off. Let me kind of distract myself for a little bit and see if I can get past it.
Yeah. Well, since we kind of like went ahead and dove into all of this, I'll go ahead and start off with some of my notes because I don't want to skip over all of that
Yeah.
and talk about other things that we're going to address as we go through this. But this is what I have. And then if you want to go over yours, you can do that. So basically, what I found was grief is an emotional and natural reaction to a significant loss.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Whatever that is. Now, most commonly it is death, but it can be
Mm-hmm.
attributed to divorce or relationships, job, an illness or a health issue. Like I
Mm-hmm.
said before, the end of an era. And so it's just, it's a personal journey and it's unique to everyone. That's why we can't judge others for how they grieve. And we may think that they're not grieving enough or too much or whatever. People need to do what they have to do to get through the situation.
Mm-hmm.
There are 5 stages of grief that I came across, and this was on multiple sites, and it's the same 5 stages. Now, these may come in different order for individuals, but these are the same 5 stages, and I would be willing to bet that it's probably going to be about the same for everyone, not the timeline, but just maybe the order, with the exception of 1 or 2. So, obviously, the first is denial.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Anytime anything traumatic happens, we're in denial. That's just the initial response. Okay, we're in shock, we're in disbelief. You don't want to accept what has happened. I think that's normal for everyone. Again, that may last a week, that may last a month, it may last 3 months. It depends on what you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a no brainer. Okay, then we get into the next stage, which is anger. I think that's also a no brainer because things are kind of starting to settle. Your situation's not changed. You're beginning to realize this is your reality, and maybe you're angry at the situation. Okay, been there,
For
done
sure.
that.
For sure.
Absolutely. Now, the next thing that I had to read on this because I didn't really understand the stage, but it's called bargaining.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I thought, well, what does that mean, bargaining in this, in relation to grief? And so it says that you're basically saying the what ifs and
Mm-hmm.
only if. And so
Yeah.
it's like you're trying to time warp the situation or
Mm-hmm.
predict the future. Well, this wouldn't have happened if I would have
Mm-hmm.
done this, or if I wouldn't have done this, or if you can go in a million directions with that.
I
And
would say that is where everybody gets stuck. Everybody can move through denial, they can move through the anger, the sadness, all the different phases, but right there is where they get hung up and think, what if I had done this, or what if this had never happened? And unless you have a time machine, it happened. And that is one place that I know for sure I've been stuck in situations, woulda, coulda, shoulda. And maybe that's not the best use of time. I think, because I am analytical, I like to think about all scenarios, but at the end of the day, does it really change what happened? No.
I also wonder if that stage happens or it's like a crossover. You can be angry and you're in this bargaining stage. That, to me, that feels like the stage that would linger the most for me,
Yeah.
is always questioning the what ifs.
Same.
And well, I'm not going to get into that because I can go down a different road. But I think also that when you're doing that, the thing to be careful about, and I'm speaking from experience, is guilt can come with that.
Sure.
And we all know what guilt can do to you. It
Yes.
literally can make you shrivel up and want to go sit in a corner. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't even have to be about grief. You can have guilt over anything. We all know that as women, as mothers, as wives,
Sure.
everyone deals with that. So that would be difficult for me, is trying to negotiate in my mind what happened and how maybe I could have prevented it.
Yeah, and I think you have to differentiate there between guilt and shame. So, guilt is, I did something bad and I feel bad about it. Shame is, I am bad
Yeah.
because of my choices. And when, especially when it's grieving the end of a relationship, whether that's romantic or whether it's a friend or even a family member, you always think, I shouldn't have said that, or I could relive that conversation. And, for me, sometimes it's even, I wish I would have said this.
Right.
And later you feel bad about it. So I think that can go one of two ways too. So guilt is for the most part healthy. Shame is not. And
Right.
that's what hangs around.
I would agree with that. The fourth phase would be depression. And
Mm-hmm.
let me just read this because I know we talked a little bit about that last week and they had some really good notes here. So this is what I wrote from that article, that, the reality sets in and everything or everyone goes back to their normal.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, especially if it's with the death, you've
Mm-hmm.
got a lot of people reaching out to you, coming over, bringing you food. If it's a relationship, um, you know, some of that can happen as well. It depends again, but eventually, after a couple of weeks or after some time, people are going to start going back to their normal routine, and so
Mm-hmm.
you're left in your thoughts a lot. Um, so you're having to come to grips with this new life of yours is the new
Mm-hmm.
norm. Okay. And the article states that this depression state, and I say, quote, depression state, is normal and it's an appropriate response to losing something or someone and is not considered a mental health condition in the context of grief.
Sure.
It's necessary for your soul to process and heal. So I think that honestly touches on what we said last week was, again, I think depression can be used a little much. Obviously, people go through depression, but
Mm-hmm.
when you're in like a depressed state or a sad
Yes.
state and it's just more temporary, again, it's being sad. It's not wanting to deal. And I get that, and I know that there's a fine line, so I'm trying to be careful, but I hope you understand, and I hope anyone that's listening understands that this process is necessary. And I think
Yes.
go ahead.
I just think depression, when you have depression or you are depressed and you can tie that back to an event, such as the death of a relationship, the death of a loved one, the loss of a job, something like that. There was a significant event that is more, you know, that it's a temporary state and it's a part of the grieving process and it's something for which you will come out on the other side. And I struggled with postpartum depression. Even that, even though it was very significant at the time, that was something that was related to an event. And so even though it's chemical and your hormones are all over the place and there are some physiological things that go along with that, it is still related to an event. So it's not a necessarily a diagnosis of clinical depression that means I'm just depressed and I really don't know why, or
Right.
I'm struggling and I really don't know why. It's not because of one specific event or a series of events. And I think that's the difference. It's normal as a human being to have emotions and feel depressed.
Yeah, that's a good point. I can see that. I would agree with that totally. Obviously, the fifth phase would be acceptance. You've gone
Yeah.
through all of these phases. And again, I think acceptance can kind of commingle with the other phases, but this is the phase where you've gotten past everything else.
Mm-hmm.
You've not gotten past the sadness, and we understand life will never be the same, but you've accepted the situation. And again, the article says acceptance is not synonymous with happiness or contentment. Okay. You just learn how, and I hate to say move on, but you learn how to live in your new
Mm-hmm.
circumstances and
Yeah.
your new norm.
Yeah, your new reality. And I realize that what I'm about to say is more relational in nature. So, as far as like when there's a betrayal or when there's some kind of broken trust with a relationship. But I heard this just last night and thought about this conversation. And it's 9 miles in and 9 miles out. And so, what that means is if it took you 9 miles to get there, it's going to take you 9 miles to get back out. And so when you're talking in the context of relationships, and if a trust is broken, it took you a while to get there. It's going to take you a while to heal and get out of it and to repair that trust. The same, I think, can be said for grief. When it's 9 miles in, that was a devastating time in your life. That was a very important relationship to you, whether it be a job, a friendship, a family member, a romantic partner, whatever that happens to be. But it's going to take you some time to get back out of that because that was a significant time in your life. And when you are faced with your new norm and your new reality, and you realize there is a death of what you thought that was going to be, I think that was probably the hardest part for me to get through.
When I think of grief as far as death, I obviously always go back to my grandparents and my uncle.
Mm-hmm.
I've
Mm-hmm.
really not um, had to deal with that. I have both of my parents, my siblings, I feel a little weird, saying things out loud, but um, because I just don't want to sound morbid. But again, my point is when it comes to grief in the death of someone that's close to me, it's my grandparents or my uncle. That has been years. My
Mm-hmm.
grandparents have both been gone for 15 years. My uncle has been gone since I was 16. So, 35 years almost. For me, when we're talking about this today, I'm going to base it off of relationships, certain moments in my life, um, the end of an era, like I mentioned earlier with my kids, but it's mainly going to be relational. Okay. Whether
Mm-hmm.
it's a friendship or an intimate relationship, because I think well, at least for me, it was just more common that those
Mm-hmm.
things happened in my life. So that's
Yeah.
where I'm mainly coming from when we talk about this tonight, but I did want to address what I feel like is a pretty credible website said in relation to this and the five phases. But one thing that I had to learn, and you've heard this a million times, and I used to tell you this, I've told everyone this, I'll get in these periods where I sound like a broken record. And I will say, I know I sound like a broken record. And
Same.
it goes back to when you said sometimes you just have to say it over and over and over.
Yes.
And if you're talking to different people, you're repeating this and this and this. And so it can be a lot. And I know it can be draining. Thank you for the people that put up with it. But one thing that I had to learn and I still struggle with is in the process of grieving the loss of a relationship, I would always stay angry.
Mm-hmm.
And again, looking back at one of the anger, okay, one of the phases of grief, I really could just sit there, crisscross applesauce, be there all day long and all night, just harboring over things. And maybe again, the bargaining phase, but I would be so angry at the situation or the
Mm-hmm.
person, and I would hold a
Sure.
grudge. And that can last a long time.
It can. And I would offer up a thought, basically, just because I went through it recently. I think, in the context of relationships, maybe subconsciously you're holding on to that anger because it's easier than facing the sadness. It's easier than facing the heartbreak that you know is just on the other side. When you realize the coulda, woulda, shoulda did not work, and this is my new reality, it's like belaboring getting to that phase. And it kind of, anger will propel you forward and allow you to quote unquote heal faster, get back to things faster because you're fueled by that anger. But at some point it comes knocking, and it might be 6 months later, it might be a year later, but you have to go through those stages. And I can say anger drove me a lot. I mean, I still get angry about it. And but I think it's really healthy to process that too, because that's a valid feeling.
I think
And
go ahead.
now, just especially If you're somebody who has dealt with a significant health issue, let's say that you were diagnosed with breast cancer and you're a very young person, your anger is going to help you fight that and get to the other side quicker. So it's not always being angry at the other person, but it might be, like you said, anger at the situation and just tearing it apart, trying to find out why.
I think for me, it was always a defense mechanism.
Sure.
Uh, my parents may say differently, I don't know, but when I was younger, I rarely cried about anything. I didn't show my emotions a lot. Now, I do cry when I get angry. I cry for anything. That's my body. That's just how it releases stress. I guess I will cry if I'm happy, sad, angry, stressed, nervous, whatever. But as
Mm-hmm.
far as letting someone know that they hurt my feelings or they hurt me, that was not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of it for me was a defense mechanism. I'm not going to hurt. You're not going to make me hurt. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not going to feel it. And being angry about it was just easier for me to do.
Sure.
And at the time, I really didn't realize how detrimental that was. And I get what you say. Sometimes it does fuel you to do better and move on and look at things in a different light. For example, like what you brought up, if you're diagnosed with a certain illness or cancer, then um, you can use that situation to make others aware of getting, annual checkups or
Mm-hmm.
fundraise for money, to go towards a certain cause or whatever. And all of that's great. And I think that is part of the process where you're
Mm-hmm.
trying to make a positive out of a negative. And I think that that's great. That just wasn't me when I was
Mm-hmm.
younger. And so you've heard this story a million times. I'm not going to go into great detail about it, but the turning point for me was when I got divorced. What was it? 13? When was that? 15 years ago. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason that, we won't go into tonight, but it was very difficult for me to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And by the grace of God, during that time after the divorce, I took the time leading up to that, and I say the next 14 months because that's how long it was before my husband and I now started dating. So I took that time to grieve, which meant
Mm-hmm.
I told myself and I allowed myself to be hurt. I
Yes.
cried about it all the time. I cried all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I allowed myself to be mad. I allowed myself to hurt. I allowed myself to go through that process of some nights just being sick at my stomach.
Mm-hmm.
But I also, and I don't know how I did it, but I also had the mindset to get more involved at my church. Now, I was already going to church at this point, and I have spoken on here about finding a group of women at my church that I was attending at the time and getting involved in that small group. I talked about it last season.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that I made myself do.
Mm-hmm.
I had to get out of my comfort zone to do it. Again, it's part of the process. So I'm going down a million different avenues, but long story short, it was all wrapped up into me needing to do what I needed to do, get myself on the other side and heal from it, not just get on the other side
Right.
and repeat the same mistakes or get in the same situation again or not get past my anger. I needed to heal and move
Mm-hmm.
on. And that is
Yes.
exactly what happened.
Yes. And that is my perspective from watching you go through it too. I remember being on the phone with you. I remember conversations, and that is my perspective, is that you took the time to heal. And you know, I know this is silly, but I'm just such a realistic person. Like, I really understand things when people paint a picture. And I often think of this subject as like a dog bite. So it is a puncture wound. It was sudden, sometimes vicious. You didn't see it coming, or you wouldn't have stood there and let the dog bite you. And then when you go to the hospital, what do? Give you a ton of rabies shots in your stomach. That's not cool. That doesn't feel good. And then they proceed to flush it out. And that is god awful. And if they don't do it, infection sets in. They can't sew it up because they sew up the infection inside. They have to irrigate it, flush it out, and then let the air and the sunlight hit it in order for it to heal. And that is so much like what we're talking about. Is you can't cover it up with a band-aid. You can't pretend it's not there. The infection will eat you from the inside out. It will be a lot worse further down the road, and you're going to be bleeding on people that didn't cut you. And that is just the perfect analogy when I think of a dog bite. Again, not something we saw coming, not something we would have asked for, but here we are. And we've got to do the work to clean it out, take our meds, and try to get better. And that's the only thing, that's the only option.
And you're only doing yourself harm by staying in this negative victim mentality state. And
Yes.
listen, sometimes you are the victim and
Yeah.
sometimes you're not. Sometimes it's mutual, but I think that you've got to figure out, I keep saying we have to figure out what
Mm-hmm.
we need to do to move on in a healthy way, because you can sit there, we can sit there and be angry all we want
Mm-hmm.
and resentful relationship wise. They
Sure.
may have moved on. They don't care that you're sitting there curled up in a
Sure.
corner. They have moved on. So who are you hurting?
Yeah, yourself.
Yeah. So it's just listen, I know it's hard and some days it may just feel like it's not worth it, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm just so glad. I wish I would have realized a lot of this when I was so much younger. But, it is what it is, and we evolve over time, and hopefully we learn from our mistakes and figure things out. But
Yeah, when you know better, do better.
that's right.
And you know this, you and I have a lot of conversations, and I share things with you, of course. But in being vulnerable, I'm 99% there. I'm there most days. I'm good. I've moved on. I would be lying if I said anger didn't bubble up. This is not what I asked for. Again, it's the dog bite. It came out of nowhere. It was unprovoked. And, here I am dealing with the consequences. And so, again, I'm good 99% of the time. I would be lying if I said that I was never angry or never had any bitterness or resentment pop up. And that's kind of the last piece that I need to shed, and it's because of that stuck phase of would have, should have, could have, and what if I had, or what if this wouldn't have happened. And you have to let that go and fully accept. You have to get to the 100%, not the 99, and just realize, hey, it is what it is. I'm good, and you know, I'm almost there.
Well, piggybacking on your analogy, what does the dog bite leave? It leaves a scar.
Yeah.
The scar is going to always be there. You can look down at it. It may not hurt you anymore, and it may
Yep.
have healed for the most part, but you can look at it and think, oh, that's when that dog bit me.
Yep.
And then move on and not think another thing about it.
Yeah.
So
I
we've
think
already kind
it's
go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
You go.
I think it's healthy too to look down at that scar and share with other people your story and how you can help them, because maybe they just got bit by the dog yesterday. And I think that's important for us as women too, to support other women. I know I've led small groups at church for different things that I've been through. And I think you have to pay it forward. And again, the dog bite doesn't hurt anymore, but you're right, the scar remains. And I think it's what you do with that scar. You can consistently cover it up, or you can use that to your advantage to try to help other people.
And you know what? I've got scars that, quite honestly, I forget that I have.
Yeah.
So it takes time. But we've already kind of gotten into this a little bit. But the next part of my notes, I have that, all of these stages are a drawn out process. And even though it's a universal experience, we all have to learn how to develop resiliency. We've talked about
Yes.
this. So, how do you do that? And then some of my own notes, and this was important for me to put and important for me to say on here. And I've kind of already touched on it a little bit, but well, before I say this, you and I have talked about before in private that sometimes people on social media are just always putting memes out there, or
Oh,
always,
yeah.
they're the post or whatever. It's just, it almost seems like, wow, you just get mistreated a lot and you don't ever mistreat other people. It
Right.
just comes across as always being a victim, or, you know, I'm this strong person and no one's gonna treat me this way and blah blah blah. You know how it goes. So I'm
Yeah.
not gonna get on my soapbox about it, but I will say, and I've had to remind myself of this, sometimes it's not your fault. So
Yeah.
I understand if you're going through a situation and it makes you feel better to put a meme on social media, okay, it may not be your fault. But here's the other side. Sometimes it is.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We are not always the victim.
Mm-hmm.
Now, maybe I need to speak for myself, but there's plenty of things I've done that weren't right. Have I just never said or done anything inappropriate? I'll just say it like that. To
Oh,
my significant other, whoever that was going to be. Okay, now we don't have to go in deep about this. It may be a small issue, it may be a big issue. My point is, we're not perfect. Okay, so
no.
before we want to be the victim and wrap ourselves up in that blanket of I'm such a victim,
Yes.
at least for me, it was healthy to always try to look at both sides.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do anything about the other person.
That's right.
You can't do anything about what they've said or what they've done, but you can do something about what you've said and what you've done. Okay.
That's
So I
right.
think it's important, because if you can't address your own issues, which is what I had to do,
Mm-hmm.
if you can't address your own issues, why would you ever think that you're going to be able to move forward and not
Yeah.
somewhat be in the same situation again? I didn't
Yeah.
want that. And as hard as it can be, I dug down deep somewhere inside of me and was able to say, Lisa, these are things you need to change about yourself.
Yeah.
And I think you've always known it, but you maybe just didn't want to deal with it, or you didn't care, or you
Well,
thought it
part
was
of
just,
that's the denial.
yeah. I maybe thought, well, this is just how I am. I just speak my mind, or I just say this or whatever. Well, that's not always right. Okay. Sometimes
Mm-hmm.
you need to just be quiet and listen, or not always say, not always say what's on your mind, or not always just want to do what you want to do. Anyway, again, getting off on a tangent.
Yes, but I suffer from that disease. We both know it. Every our 25 subscribe 26 now, because we got a note
Actually,
from
I looked
somebody.
and sorry to interrupt. On
Yeah,
YouTube, we're up to 30.
that's amazing.
I haven't looked
Um,
on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, but anyway,
yeah.
we're gradually going up.
Well, I I suffer from that disease. Anybody who's ever been within a 5 mile radius of me knows that, is that I speak my mind and all of that. Um, but yes, you have to look in the mirror, and soul searching and self reflection is really hard. When you get honest with yourself, and even if you are the victim in that situation, there are things that you have done that are not appropriate and that you should not have done. And, you know, honestly, how many people have pulled out in front of somebody? Did you do it on purpose? Most of the time, no, you didn't. You didn't see them coming, or you didn't realize they were going so fast, or whatever. It's not all about you. you know it's not.
Right.
You have to at some point figure out, hey, they didn't mean it. I've got to stop taking offense to things and just move on.
Right. And what I had to learn and what was important for me was this sounds so contradictory, but I had to stop feeling guilty or stop feeling like I couldn't say something or feel a certain way because of things that I said or did previously in
Yes.
my past, whether it was 30 years ago or a year ago. And I almost would just accept my fate, so to speak, because I felt like I couldn't say anything, or maybe that's just what I deserved.
Right.
So I think that just because those moments existed doesn't mean that they have to continue to exist.
Yeah.
Okay, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We can change our path. We can go in a different direction. So I think that obviously our decisions in the past shape who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is who they are based off of the life that they've lived, but
Right.
it doesn't have to define the direction that you're going. You know what I'm saying? And
Yes.
so
Yes.
I think that it's almost like those bad decisions don't have to ride your coattail into the future.
Right. And we can change at any point. You can decide, I'm not going to let that happen again. And you can just determine, I'm not at fault, or I was at fault, or whatever the situation is. But you also have to be vulnerable. You have to keep your walls down, and you have to move forward from it, but in a healthy way. You can't just put on this armor of, like you said, I had to face it. You said I had to cry, I had to be angry, I had to look myself in the mirror, I had to process through it. And processing through it is a lot easier down the road. It's a lot harder in the moment. It's a lot easier to ignore it completely. And that's not healthy. And the more you shove it down means the later that you're going to have a geyser in the future.
I do remember thinking that once I allowed myself to grieve, I was surprised at how quickly I got past that pit that I was in.
Yeah.
And so when I say that, I'm talking about a couple of months. It
Yeah.
and again, this may take longer for other people, and it depends on the situation, but when I compared it to other things that I had tried to deal with in my life or didn't deal with, and it just
Mm-hmm.
lingered, or that continued putting me on a path that I didn't need to be on because I wasn't addressing issues. So it lasted years. Okay.
Right.
But
Right.
when I finally decided to grieve the loss of a relationship, the failure of something else once again in my life,
Mm-hmm.
once I allowed myself to grieve, which took me down a path of addressing issues and healing, I
Mm-hmm.
was able to move forward. And I was so surprised at how quickly I was able to do that.
Yeah. And I will say that also, when you don't deal with it in a healthy way, and you don't look yourself in the mirror and you go through the whole process of grief, When you don't do that, that's when substance abuse happens, shopping addiction, gambling, drinking, endless relationships with people that you should not be in relationship with. And when you don't deal with your problems will deal with you. And that is difficult to face. But it's
That's right.
true. I mean, we all have this, hole, and we try to fill that hole with everything instead of the right things and the healthy things. And we end up really on a destructive path. And I'm speaking from experience. I've done it many times throughout my life. It's
Mhm.
easier to do that, but it's harder in the long run because, like you said, you belabor the healing, you belabor the issues, and you end up causing a lot of harm to yourself and to others.
Some of the things that I did, listen, this isn't for everyone. Again, you and I, we always talk off of experience and our situations. So, what worked for me, and this is an overall list, whether again it's death, relationships, job, whatever. I cried, which
Mm-hmm.
for me was not something that I ever did. I allowed myself to cry a lot. I did allow myself to be angry and at myself too, not just
Mm-hmm.
the other person or the situation, at myself too. I allowed myself to be angry. I talked about it. I mean, like I can still, you mentioned this earlier, I can still vividly remember at times when you would call me to check on me. And there was a time where you were calling weekly. I even remember sitting in my driveway a couple of times when you had called, and I can still picture myself sitting there looking at what I was looking at and being on the phone with you. That those memories have never been erased from my mind.
Yeah.
You can talk about it. I tend to be a person that likes closure.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Same.
some people don't, especially when it comes to the death of someone, but I like closure. So sometimes I will go a route that other people don't go through, where I'll look at old photos. I
Mm-hmm.
may write my feelings. Music was a huge thing for me. Listening to
Sure.
certain songs, and listen, you talk about getting in your emotions and all the feels when a song comes on and having
Oh
a
yeah.
really good cry.
Oh yeah.
Music was key to me, and support groups or friendships. And
Mm-hmm.
again, you know who your friends are. You know who your your go-to people are, and if you don't feel like those are the ones that's going to give you really sound advice, I'm not saying ditch those people, but maybe you can look for others that have been through your situation
Yeah.
or that can give you a different perspective. And sometimes you have to seek those individuals out, like I had to do. Um, because at that time in my life, I had younger kids. I had a lot going on. So my life was different than it is now. I wasn't going on girls' trips and hanging
Yeah.
out with a bunch of women all the time like I do now. That
Yeah.
wasn't that wasn't something that was in my life other than you and my other friend that lives out of town. So sometimes you just got to get out of your comfort zone and look for others, and don't just drown yourself in this victim mentality. Even if
Yeah.
you are a victim, somehow try to just get yourself out of it and move forward and just focus on yourself and bettering yourself and your situation and just try to move on.
Yeah, and I think a word of advice, not that anybody cares, but a word of advice, if I could give myself when I was in my 20s, is obviously you're going to have acquaintances and you're going to have friends that you work with and that kind of thing. So I'm not talking about that. But if you look at your really close circle of friends and you cannot imagine that person sitting in the hospital room with you, they're probably not your friend. We are not meant to do life alone. Yes, we need our alone time. Yes, we need to decompress. Yes, sometimes we want to get in our shell and process things on our own, but we are not meant to do life alone. And if all of your relationships and your closest friends are superficial and you could not imagine having some kind of diagnosis or being in the hospital and them being there for you, they're not your friends. And we as women need to help each other, support each other, be there for each other, because nobody else is coming. Nobody else is going to come and solve your problems. And we need to support each other and help each other. And that includes grief and not.
Absolutely. Um, I guess trying to wrap up a little bit right here, I'll just kind of share a story and then I'll let you give some closing thoughts. But one thing that I learned or that I'm learning about grief is not only does there come healing, but there comes appreciation. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what I mean by that is, and now this is going back to my grandparents. So, my dad, called me yesterday just to tell me happy birthday. Now, let me back up a little bit. My granddad he was very much a man's man,
Mm-hmm.
really tough, really athletic. He could be, hardcore if he needed to, but he was also very silly. He joked
Mm-hmm.
around a lot. He was silly. And he probably was more so like that with his grandkids and his great grandchildren than he was his kids, probably like
Yeah,
most parents and, when they turn into grandparents. But again,
sure.
so when my dad called me yesterday to tell me happy birthday, I answered the phone and he didn't say anything. So I said hello again. And all of a sudden, this song just starts playing in the background. And I think I don't know, it's some happy birthday song or whatever. So it
Mm-hmm.
wasn't my dad. And the first thing I thought was, oh my gosh, this sounds exactly like something Papa would do. So he
Yeah.
gets on the phone after it plays and he says, happy birthday. And the first thing I said was, that sounded just like something Papa would do. And so he and I just sat there and laughed about it. And then
Mm-hmm.
he said, okay, well, bye. We didn't even talk. He just played the
Yeah.
song and I said that. So my point to saying all that is, you know, my grandparents have been gone for 15 years. They
Mm-hmm.
passed away a year and a half apart. And when I can still get emotional talking
Mm-hmm.
about my grandparents like I am right now, or when I tell my father that's something like what Papa would do, the fact that they're always on my mind, like it's not like I just think about my grandparents when their birthdays roll around or something special happens. I'm always thinking about them. It doesn't matter what it is. I always am thinking about my grandparents. And I think that's a testament to who they were
Mm-hmm.
and our relationship. So I still grieve over my grandparents, but that shows me how much appreciation that I have for them for being such a
Mm-hmm.
positive influence in my life and that I still have such fond memories of them. And my
Yes.
kids know all of this. I talk about my grandparents to them. Now, obviously, my daughter remembers them because she was a little bit older, but especially my youngest and even my middle child, they just have sporadic memories. But sometimes they'll say,
Mm-hmm.
oh, yeah, I remember that. And I'm like, do you remember that? Or do you just remember me telling you that? So I'm
Right.
always talking about my grandparents. So I think um, with grief also comes appreciation. And so you can continue on someone's memory and appreciate. I wish I would have appreciated my grandparents more when they were alive than
Sure.
when they weren't. I was younger and I wish I would have known it, but I know it now and I've known it for the past 15 years and that won't ever change. And so I can only hope that my kids and my grandkids and even my friends and other family members are still talking about me and laughing and getting emotional at the mention of my name 15 years after I've left this earth.
Well, for sure, you will have one person doing that. I can guarantee you that. Although I'm probably going out of here before you do. But but yeah, I what it was important to me to do this segment because of where I am in my life. And I'm about to be on the other, none of us are promised tomorrow. None of us. I could go tonight, but I know that just looking at the reality of the situation, I'm about to be um, in a lot of grief, losing my dad and my grandmother, probably back to back. And I know that I will look back because I'm very close to my grandmother, have always been close to
Mhm.
her, and I've had her for 50 years. So I know that I will be looking back and telling stories for years to come. And this is just one little God wink thing. I believe that my baby is graduating from college on my grandmother's birthday, my other grandmother. And the reason that is significant is that the university where my son is graduating from, my grandmother, who, if she was living, would be 100 and, gosh, 12.
Oh, wow.
She was born in 1913. She went there to that university when
Oh,
it was a teacher's college. And so it's come full circle. So I think he's graduating on her birthday in May.
that's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Oh,
She used to tell stories about she and her roommate making beer. And, this was an old house and they made it upstairs and it kind of overflowed and went through the floor, through the boards in the floor down to the lower levels. So I'm sure that my son has also spilled beer down, during his college time, and it's just fun um that he might be graduating on her birthday, which is kind of cool.
that's pretty neat. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm,
Well, I've enjoyed talking about this, and I really love when we get deep.
me too.
And, I love funny stuff. I love to laugh. It's my favorite thing in the world. But I do think there are a lot of people our age, especially with aging parents, maybe have lost children, lost family members, and then also, like we talked about, other relationships and other circumstances that they're grieving. And I think it's important for us to talk about. And again, having that support as women is really important to me.
Yeah, I agree. Obviously, some things you will be able to move on from, and other things you won't totally ever move on from that. So I
Sure.
think it's just important to try to find a way to live life to the fullest, even though there's a piece of your heart that's still missing. Because again, like
Yes.
we've said before, that's life and things will happen. And so we just don't want to get ourselves in a pit that we can't get out of.
Yes. Yep.
But
Share your scars.
that's right. But next week will be more lighthearted. I think we've already talked about. I think we're gonna have. Are we gonna do the Q&A thing or?
Yeah, I think we're going to
Yeah,
have a little fun.
yeah. So
Break it up a little.
the next week will be kind of fun, and it'll be a lot more lighthearted. Hearted. So we'll get into all of that later on. But
Yeah.
anyway, so
Well, have a good evening.
you too.
Bye.
Bye.